I'm very happy to be moderating the session today, which we're doing in partnership with Wipro. Um, it aims to take a look at what's happening with digital infrastructure in society and in business, especially now that two things are very specifically engaged. One is the new world that COVID has created globally. And the second is the shift to 5G telecommunications, 5G wireless, which is a wholesale transformation of the way that wireless happens and will happen. So I'm super excited to have two really great guests to discuss that. Mo Katibeh is the President and Chief Marketing Officer of AT&T Business, and a real expert on what is changing for infrastructure for business. So really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Milan is president of Wipro and also is their global head of manufacturing, marketing, innovation, and technology. And he oversees their manufacturing and communications business. And you have a long title, Milan. I hope I got it right. You have so many things you're responsible for. So I'm not going to try to make an introduction. I'm going to let the two panelists do that. And I'd like to start with you, Mo. So everybody kind of knows we were headed into a new world of wireless and infrastructure with 5G rapidly evolving before COVID hit. Now we have even another layer of transformation on top of that. How do you see the world changing, and particularly when you think of infrastructure? What should business leaders understand about what's happening now and what's changing?
David, first and foremost, thanks for having me, and good to be here with you this morning and with Milan. And thanks for everyone who's joining via the web. But really enjoying these sorts of virtual events when we can't get together in person, and hopefully we can all do that again at some point in the future. So, as I think about the point you were making, which is, how is COVID further accelerating this shift towards digital? I was recently with one of my friends earlier this week, and we were having this exact conversation. He's actually in India, and he made the comment, it really resonated with me, which is, COVID is the final push to digital. When you think about, businesses around the world, everyone's kind of at a different point on this bell curve towards the digital transformation. Obviously, digital transformation has been a movement that's been underway over the last several years. And COVID has really helped, illustrate and separate that in this post-COVID world, there's going to be winners and losers. And a lot of that will be defined by where people were on this evolutionary path towards truly digitizing their business, both in terms of how they operate, as well as how they serve their end customers. One of the big winners right now is e-commerce. As people are staying at home and not going out, then things like collaboration solutions, the ability to buy everything online, from shoes to food to necessities to entertainment, et cetera, is really skyrocketing. So when I think about that through a 5G lens, clearly it becomes, how do we use 5G and the capabilities of 5G from an infrastructure perspective to further accelerate our adoption of digital or move towards a digital 2.0, AKA how can we use this technology to further get our customers comfortable with interacting with us as a business in a post-COVID world, or in many cases, just getting them comfortable coming back into the business environment, whether that's aviation, hospitality, entertainment companies, et cetera. 5G can truly differentiate and drive comfort for businesses that are thinking through, how do I need to change? How do I need to either get more efficient, take out costs, or create entirely new experiences for my employees to keep them safe, or to demonstrate to my end customers that, hey, I'm really thinking how I can use this technology to keep you safe coming back in. So we can go through, as during the Q&A, and as we get deeper into this, by industry and how that's playing out. But I'll give you one real example. If you think about retail today, all of us are used to going in and trying on clothes, right? So you go in, is it the right fit? Does it look good together? I stand in front of a mirror. and then I purchase something maybe off the shelf, et cetera. And we already have big retailers that are reaching out to us, mindful of, in a post-COVID world, perhaps people won't want to try on clothes. Perhaps mentally they may be thinking, who was the last person who touched this? Is there germs on it, whether it's COVID or any sort of health aspect and questions that may be coming up. And so they're thinking through the infrastructure of 5G and cellular umbrella within their stores that can enable a next generation experience like Magic Mirror, right? There's lots of different words for this, but essentially large digital displays coupled with 4K as a sensor video cameras that are pointing at a person, and now you can virtually try on any piece of clothing. It can use polygons to determine the right shape and size of the clothes that you need to be wearing. And on top of that, it's a much more seamless and quicker experience. Instead of needing to walk into a changing room, I can literally try on one jacket. I can see all of the color combinations. The display can give me recommendations on accessories and belts and shoes and pants or dresses and blouses, what have you. And then at the end of it, I don't even need to take a piece of clothing off the rack. I can simply use a 5G or mobile enabled tablet or device, finish the purchase, and then it's drop shipped to my home in a very clean and healthy way, and away you go. So that allows you to rethink your footprint. It allows you to rethink your customer experience, and all of it can be enabled by the capabilities that 5G and 5G infrastructure is bringing to bear.
Talk for a second before we go to Milan about what makes the 5G infrastructure different from the infrastructure that we've had thus far.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, when many people think about 5G, they think about, these sorts of, mobile devices, right? And what a lot of people don't realize about 5G is that it's more than just about the outdoor or in-home mobile experience for voice and data and speed. It's also about really, really low latency. So think about that as how quickly the network responds to your commands, as well as about massive connectivity, or the ability to attach up to 1 million IoT things per 5G access point. So that's quite different than LTE and Wi-Fi, right? Wi-Fi is kind of a couple of hundred things per access point, and LTE it's up to 1,000 things per access point. So in a 5G world, not only do you have the massive speed and capacity, material increase, step function increase over LTE, but it's also that low latency and connectivity. So going back to that example we were talking about, when you think about a Magic Mirror or any sort of VR, AR technology, a lot of people today, when they put on VR, they get dizzy, they don't like it, it's maybe a little bit nauseating. And the reason for that is the latency of the image that they're seeing versus how quickly their brain is processing the reality of that. And if those two things get out of sync, AKA the latency is longer, then most humans, perceive that as a nauseating experience. So with 5G, getting that latency under 20 milliseconds or even under 10 milliseconds essentially gets you to as fast as your brain processes the reality around you. And that is a material difference than the experience over Wi-Fi or LTE.
Yeah, and I know there's a whole lot of other differences that 5G brings, which maybe we'll get a chance to touch on some of in a minute. So, Milan, from your standpoint, I mean, you look at a really wide range of phenomena happening in business and society in your role as president of Wipro. When you think of the digital infrastructure and how it's shifting, what are the first things that comes to your mind?
Well, again, thanks, David, for having me here, and as well as Mo. It's great interacting. Digital transformation, I think the way I look at it is going to be on steroids. In fact, I was talking to some of my colleagues last week, and I was telling them that, what has happened in the COVID world is the digital glass ceiling has been broken. There were so many naysayers on digital, and it was hard for, CIOs or CTOs or CDOs to actually get through that glass ceiling and ensure that digital transformation takes place within their organization. but that is actually being broken. And you know, many times in a sales cycle, you often say that in order to make a concept sell, you need to have a proof of concept. Well, you know what? The proof of concept is here. Everyone's living through the proof of concept. And therefore, I feel that, you know, the glass ceiling has been broken, and therefore people are going to start looking at digital infrastructure as the infrastructure. You know, one of the things that, you know, Wipro and some of the other technology companies used to talk about is what is the percentage of digital? You know, and we've kind of taken a decision not to talk about a percentage of digital as revenues, simply because everything now is moving towards digital. So we have created an interesting framework, David, which we call the 4M model. How do you look at digital transformation? And it fundamentally impacts the model. You know, so what is your business model and what is your delivery model in a new digital world, right? So is it about, of course, it could be about work from home, but it could be in the sense that Mo talked about online retail changing completely and, you know, overwhelmingly. And, you know, is e-commerce going to be called e-commerce? Or is that all commerce now, right? But offline retail may start looking at things like contactless payments, curbside pickups. So your fundamental model of delivery changes. And I think so the model is important. The second one is the method. You know, so how are you putting together the way that you work with your customers or your consumers or your employees? The structuring of what you do has to change, right? The third one is around machinery. And, you know, of course, in a manufacturing world, you could talk about machinery in terms of robotics and, you know, what the interplay is. But machinery is a lot about tools. You know, how do you make sure that automation, you know, happens at a different level? How do you make sure that, you know, security tools are put in place? How do you make sure that agile tools are put in place? What are the new tools and new machinery that you're looking on to deliver? And the fourth M is the mindset, you know, because ultimately a digital mindset and a digital native mindset is very different from a traditional mindset. And are you able to shift the mindset in a way? And, you know, the just tremendous examples in a very short period of time. And one which really comes to mind is how people have been able to, in a very, very short period of time, able to enable services from work from home and BCP for our customers. And, you know, I mean, we've got a great example of, you know, one of the airports, you know, suddenly we had to go for a lockdown and we had less than 48 hours to get essentially a frontline service to move to the back end and enable work from home. So it's a large change management, right? It's not just about enabling work from home. It's about enabling people to think about how are they going to be delivering this from work from home? How are we going to enable them mentally to attune to that work from home? How are we going to have reviews? And how are we going to make sure that every SLA that we have to perform is going to be performed? Because you never think about such dramatic changes in a very short period of time, which could be like 24 or 48 hours. Everybody, I mean, we do a lot of BCP for our clients and of course internally, but the scale for which is
BCP being business continuity planning for anybody who doesn't know.
Business continuity planning. Yeah, absolutely.
The scale you're saying.
Yes. So the whole point is that how do you enable that within a 24 or 48 hour is not so much just about the model and the method and the tools and the machinery. It's also about the mindset. And I think, you know, if we look at these four areas, I feel that we can leverage, and our clients and our consumers can leverage this digital transformation to our advantage.
You know, one of the things that a 5G ecosystem is going to enable, especially when it's integrated with cloud as it will be, et cetera, you know, we're going to have so much more data, and the capacity to bring efficiency through analyzing that data to a vast range of different parts of society. So Milan, talk about a few ways you think that may happen, and especially if you have any thoughts on how it might evolve slightly differently now that we have these new concerns. And maybe Mo, you could chime in on that after Milan.
Sure. And you know, the way that you start looking at it is data as an atom, right? So what does fundamentally, you know, and especially with the advancements in 5G, you know, the amount of data, Mo talked about a million things per access point. So the most fundamental thing that I see between 4G and 5G as an example is the fact that, you know, 4G and 3G and previous technologies were more about the consumer, and they were more about handset and devices. Whereas now it's about everything wireless coming together, right? So it could be people, of course, but it could be, you know, your refrigerator, it could be industrial machinery, it could be aeroplanes. It's just millions of things coming together under one umbrella or one framework. And therefore, the amount of data that is getting generated is no longer in multiples of 10 or multiples of 100, but it's in multiples of millions. And so fundamentally with data, you look at, you know, two things. We certainly look at two things a little bit more minutely than we would otherwise look at. The first one is analytics tools around data. And before we get into analytics, it is about how do you aggregate this data? How do you process this data? How do you organize this data? And then how do you analyze this data to give the right, you know, business operations and business efficiencies? And I think, you know, a very interesting example of this is fundamentally the shifts that have taken place, and I'm sure Mo can talk about it, that have taken place in terms of, you know, how the data has changed at broadband levels, how it has changed at mobile levels, how are we ensuring that, you know, people working from home, you know, couples working from home, their kids attending virtual school, and then, you know, others doing gaming all at the same time, you know, how do you manage the data? So the one part is the management of the data. The second part is the analytics of the data, right? So in terms of analytics, I think, you know, think about what was the single biggest thing in retail. You know, retailers or malls were fundamentally looking at if there's a person who comes in with a mobile device, you know, how do we make sure that we're able to provide the right inputs to her in order to go to the right outlets to take care of, you know, the best offers which are available there, and so on and so forth. Now imagine that situation has changed. So you're completely now moving towards an e-commerce platform. Now the same set of people are going to behave differently than the digitally native who were behaving earlier, right? So you have to start looking at AI, ML, start thinking about, you know, what were the people who were on e-commerce platforms earlier to, let's call them the relative newbies in e-commerce. How is that analysis and how is that pattern of buying changing dramatically? And the third area that we need to look at is all of this data and all of these millions of access points. There is potential security issues, right? And therefore, we need to start looking at how do we make sure that organizations' data is protected. I think information security is very, very important. Traditionally, we've talked about cybersecurity. We talked about hacking of, you know, firewalls and hacking of enterprise servers. But now you're actually talking about data and information security at the endpoint level. And how do we make sure that that data is secure, and the analysis and the constant interaction of data between an organization and a consumer and an organization and a thing, and I'm really talking about IoT, continues to happen and happen at a rapid level. So I think some of those interesting outcomes of data are really what we're looking at right now. And those are the areas in which there is accelerated usage and accelerated requirements coming in from clients.
Thanks, Milan. So Mo, how do you think of this intersection between, 5G, cloud, data, and analytics, and what's going to be fundamentally different?
It's a great question, and I'll build on what Milan said just a moment ago, which is first, let's talk about the cloud, right? So as you're deploying these 5G networks and these material number of access points that are consuming all of this data, in order to enable that extremely low latency connection, you actually need to bring the cloud much, much closer to the end user, right? Whether it's a business or all of us living in our personal lives.
That's a real infrastructure point too.
Exactly, exactly. And so people out there may be asking, well, why? Well, when you think about the cloud, it's this beautiful ethereal term, but it really just means someone else's computer sitting somewhere else in some data center, which is processing an application or an experience that now I'm consuming as a business or consumer. Now, in America, most of those cloud infrastructure nodes today are sitting on one of the two coasts, right? And so that generally means that they're hundreds or thousands of miles away from all of us, especially those of us sitting in Middle America. Bringing that cloud closer to get that sub 20 millisecond experience means generally it needs to be within, call it 10 to 20 miles of the major population areas, the major metros across the US or frankly around the world. This plays out no matter what country you're in. So over the next 5 years, we should fully expect to see, and already we're seeing the announcements. We've declared that with Microsoft, we're working with them to bring their Azure stack into major metros. Other players in the communication space have made other announcements with other clouds. And at the end of the day, you should imagine this is going to be a fairly agnostic ecosystem. It's going to take companies working together to make this a reality, to bring the user experience layer closer in. So kind of key point one, the infrastructure.
Could I just quickly ask a question? So that means more smaller data centers. And is that essentially another way of describing what's also called edge computing, or is that something completely different?
No, that's so the answer is yes. Think of it as smaller, more distributed data centers. And then that is exactly what the word edge computing, the term edge computing means. Now, obviously edge computing is hot. People are using that term to mean different things, but generally it means bringing the compute or the cloud closer to the end user. And from an AT&T perspective, we actually have what we call two flavors of edge compute. That which sits at the business location. That could be a hospital, it could be a manufacturing facility, big box retail, it could be a venue or a stadium where you need really, really low latency, that compute to be crazy close to the end user. Imagine for things like sports betting inside of a venue. Tens of thousands of people, whether it's for gamification or for gambling type purposes, you need that cloud, that edge compute right there. Or it can be in the major metro. We call that network edge compute. That can be for things like highly distributed IoT use cases like Milan was talking about a moment ago. So just to give you an example of that, it was actually the next place I was going. Now you've got this edge compute, this cloud closer in, you've built that infrastructure. When you think about IoT and the connectedness of all things, right? So a lot of people like to talk about autonomous vehicles as a use case for 5G. And I always point out to them, we have autonomous vehicles today. And by the way, they are working really well. You don't actually need 5G for autonomous vehicles. There's other technologies, LiDAR, and cars are detecting the next car and the next thing that's within some circumference of them. And they're pausing and taking intelligent actions. What you need 5G for is to act as the network broker between all of the things. As an example, I have a 9-year-old. He likes to ride his bicycle. The bicycle, the connected bicycle in the future, can now use the network 5G and edge compute as a broker to talk to cars. So if he's riding his bike down the street, that's talking, even if it's not within LiDAR distance of autonomous vehicle.
Which is a safety feature. Yeah.
Exactly. As a safety feature to say, okay, hey, the vehicle is talking to the person who's walking, it's talking to your kid on their bicycle, it is talking to the infrastructure, the stoplight, et cetera. all of these things, the network, the 5G network and edge compute becomes the broker to interface between all of these elements. And this is truly where you're going to start seeing that AI and the machine learning layer sitting on top of all of this data that's been exposed from all of these elements to make intelligent decisions. And this is how the fabric of commerce in our society will be fundamentally shifted in the coming years by 5G.
Wow. I just want to ask one architectural question, infrastructure question. So you've got these data centers moving closer to the customer, so to speak, closer to the city, closer to the hospital or whatever. Is AT&T building those itself? Who owns those? And just quickly talk a little bit about the architecture. And if Milan wants to jump in on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Yeah, this is a real infrastructure question.
It is an infrastructure question. So to get the edge compute and 5G networks to work together, and by the way, not just 5G, but wired fiber networks as well, you have to integrate the infrastructure in a physical way, right? So you need fiber connections from businesses, you need 5G and IoT connections to go to that cloud compute stack, whether it's Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or IBM or what have you, in order to bring that low latency user experience to the vehicle, to the bicycle, to the, to your clothing, to the magic mirror, what have you. So you can build that infrastructure at different places. We talked about you can do it inside the hospital. So you can imagine in that scenario, from an AT&T perspective, we power connections between all things, between people, between machines, between businesses and consumers and clouds. We're very interested in call that the cellular umbrella, the connection layer and the routing of the application traffic. But then the hardware stack, we can be agnostic to that. The business customer can decide for themselves what their preference is, right? Do they want to use X infrastructure manufacturer or Y? Do they want to use X cloud stack or Y cloud stack? But the integration of those things matters, which means companies have to work together. The network edge works in the same way. Those can happen inside of our central offices. It can happen in a third-party location. But the magic sauce, the secret sauce of this, if you will, is that it won't work unless the infrastructure and the cloud stack, the infrastructure stack, is merged in some way.
Milan, jump in any way you want, but I have a question which you can even dispense with if it's not really of relevance. But, as somebody who's covered tech for 30 some years, there's a back to the future element of this. Companies used to have their own servers. Then we went to outsourcing and then we went to cloud, and it was, this constant dialect between local and distant. And are we sort of going a little bit back to the future then, Milan?
Well, I think, I just look at all of infrastructure as an evolution. Ultimately, the one thing that I would add to what Mo mentioned just now is that, all of this requires fundamentally for the entire network to be software defined. And therefore, the fundamental change, which actually came about even with 4G technologies, but continues to massively accelerate, is software-defined networks and virtualization, right? So in a sense, when you ask me this question of back to the future, yes, you're right that we are going towards that, but in a virtualized way. So you're no longer looking at the same thing as a physical entity, you're looking at it as a virtual entity. And therefore, everything, whether it's infrastructure, storage, compute, network, application, I think everything is going to get software defined. And that's why, you have containerization of applications, and that's why the entire 5G ecosystem, therefore, now is no longer about, you asked this question, Mo might just pile on to me on this one, but I have to make the statement that it's no longer about AT&T. It's about, so there is a network element to it, but ultimately when you're talking about edge computing, it is about how do you deliver the cloud infrastructure, the network infrastructure, the storage, the compute, the intelligence, the security, all at one time. So it's a very large ecosystem play. It's no longer a network play. And that's why, companies such as ourselves come into play. That's how, Mo talked about, Microsoft, AWS, Google, IBM, and others. That's how, VMware and Nutanix. And so, all a host of different companies come into play to deliver the edge compute.
That's interesting. In fact, so when Mo talks about, say, the hospital deciding which of the cloud providers or whatever it might use, different elements they have to bring together, Wipro could be their partner in figuring that out in a sense, right? For example.
Absolutely. I mean, it could be. It could be Wipro as a partner. It could be, and I think
AT&T probably does that too.
More and more, exactly. I was saying this, that, more and more, everybody needs to look at a holistic picture of what needs to be provided, right? So it cannot be, this was what, I used to do, and I'm going to continue doing that.
Yeah.
Because there is a push towards ensuring that what I really want, let's take the example of the hospital. What I really want is that the physical infrastructure in the hospital is no longer going to be able to take patients of all categories and all requirements. So telehealth is going to increase, which is something that, we know that it's going to happen. But home care is going to increase dramatically. One of the biggest things which is going to happen in the post-COVID era, in my opinion, in the health business, is going to be home care. Because right now, people, if they have smaller ailments, they aren't going to the clinic or the hospital in the same way that they would have gone 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And similarly, hospitals would not want, from their capacity perspective, bring in patients who they can deliver the facilities at their home to the hospital, right? So there's a fundamental change in the infrastructure planning, demand planning, forecasting, and then making sure that you're able to deliver the service at the end consumer level, which is really what you want to do. So it's a process of not just looking at your infrastructure, but it's looking at your process, it's looking at your customer delivery, all of it in a more holistic fashion.
Okay, well, I see we've got a ton of questions from the audience, but before we go to them, I want to ask Mo one thing, and I just want to first make an observation before I ask you the question. One of the things I just realized from listening to the two of you is, and I've thought a lot about 5G, but I realized 5G, sometimes we think of it as a sort of telecommunications advance and has a lot to do with frequencies and radio broadcast, et cetera, which of course it does. But in a sense, the thing that makes it so important is the degree to which it is a software advance that happen. It's a set of software advances that have been more fully embraced into a set of wireless standards, perhaps, than in any previous generation. First of all, is that a reasonable thing to say? And then the other question, Mo, just to throw it in now, is how far are we along in the process of deploying this 5G thing?
Okay, yeah. So David, first and foremost, I'd say, look, it's both, right? So like LTE, though obviously on steroids, 5G requires both a physical infrastructure build. You've got to have fiber and radio heads, and then the spectrum is the last little part of that, if you will, that enables the connectivity to the end thing. So there's absolutely, I've been scanning the questions as they're coming in, so I'll address one of them, which is, if you think about outdoor coverage, the infrastructure build and getting that done, whether it's a developing country or a developed country or rural or urban or what have you, is the long pole in the tent of enabling 5G, right? In a business environment, venues, big box, manufacturing, hospital, it's actually quite simple because you think of that as a finite space. You can go in and work with that enterprise customer immediately and get it done on whatever time frame works for them. You don't have to think through regulatory aspects like site acquisition, zoning, permitting, et cetera, to get the infrastructure build done. And then software obviously sits on top of that to enable the routing of that data back. Look at the artificial intelligence layer sitting on top on what are the insights and the outcomes that we want to drive with that data. So software is just as important, but they go hand in hand. And then I think I addressed your second part, which is how far along are we? From an AT&T perspective, we already have 5G deployed in about 190 cities across the United States. And we've said that we're going to have nationwide coverage. Think of that as, over a couple of 100 million people covered by summer of this year. And then we can work with any business to go deploy 5G into their physical location in whatever time frame works for them, no matter where they are in the United States today.
Wow. Okay, Josh, I'm going to let you do a little brokering of questions here. So go right ahead.
Great. Thanks, David, and thanks, Mo and Milan. I guess the first question we have on was about regulation and the regulatory environment related to 5G. Mo, I guess if you want to respond to that, as far as what is the wish list from the carrier community, from a regulation standpoint, and how will that impact sort of the scale and the speed of deployment?
I think I addressed that a little bit in my last comment, but I'll just reinforce that whether it was 1G or 4G or 5G, the work that we do with every local city and municipality to deploy the infrastructure for outdoor coverage, not indoor, but talk about kind of the outdoor use cases, is critical and key. And so the ability, no matter where you are in the US or frankly the world, to create a very simple and repeatable motion that allows the carriers to go and deploy new infrastructure in a very timely fashion means that you get these new capabilities faster. And just kind of broadly around the world, you can see that deployments are happening faster in countries where it's very streamlined and clear on that process. And it's something, that we work on every single day with, local, state, and federal officials across the United States.
Great. We have another question here. I know there were some issues internationally. I think London, there were 5G towers being burnt down. People were, talking about health concerns of 5G. How would you sort of address just sort of as people? I mean, I'm sure if you look at cellular over the years, everyone's talked about potential health risks, but specifically there's a question here about health concerns and health risks. Anything you'd want to comment on that?
Could I also mention that came in from our Techonomy member, Joshua Ngoma in Johannesburg, which I love. So hi, Joshua, and go right ahead, answer that.
I'm going to point everyone out to the World Health Organization on this one. They have very clearly stated that there are no health risks tied to 5G. One of the benefits talking about regulations is that cellular in general, no matter where you are on Earth, but especially in the United States, is a heavily regulated industry with massive amounts of work that goes into the health aspects of it before any new technology is deployed. And the net is there are no health risks. This is, to borrow a phrase, fake news. And I think that's all I need to say on that.
Great. And we have a question for Milan from John Breen. John, you should now be able to ask your question about that breaking the glass ceiling that Milan had mentioned. Let's see if we get John on there. John, are you able to?
Yep, I just unmuted. Thank you. Hey, Milan, thanks for your discussion and comment about how this pandemic has broken us through the glass ceiling. So the thought is, okay, is at some point now businesses have to kind of advertise a scorecard to say how digital are they? And does that actually give them now a competitive advantage to go full all in? Whereas in the past, maybe we're holding back. That's my question.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. First of all, I think, John, companies do need to look at what is the extent to which they're going digital. I mean, fundamentally look at the environment now. If you were in retail, your entire business model of offline has changed, right? Even if it's for a shorter duration of time, but it will change. There are things like social distancing, which are going to come in, health-oriented issues, whether you want to have contact payment or contactless payments and so on and so forth. So your business model is definitely changing, and you need to look at that. The second part is that customers' journeys fundamentally change, right? When the customer journey changes, the only way you can adapt is to digitally adapt to that change. So companies have to look at, and CEOs and CXOs need to look at, what is it that is changing about my model? What is it that is changing about my consumer behavior or customer behavior? And thirdly, what are the ways in which I can embrace digital technology and advancements such as 5G to make sure that I provide value-added services to our customers? There's certain things that we could have never thought of before. And a simple thing which many of the retailers are doing is curbside pickup. It's just an example. So how do we provide that? How do I then, the last point is, how do I look at my internal processes and change them so that I'm in touch with what is happening in the external world? As an example, if you're a manufacturing company, how do you make sure that the fact that you cannot do maintenance work in the same way today moves towards digitally enabled maintenance? One of the great examples that we have is, can you provide service on an on-tap basis, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. We're talking to one of the telcos that they have these, huge issues with networks. They've got poles all over. How do you go and examine those poles? So we are now looking at a robotic pole climber, which will combine robotics and computer vision to enable them to examine those poles remotely. A second example could be on AR, VR, right? A lot of people have these maintenance folks right up front. They don't know what exactly they are supposed to do at that place when they're faced with a problem, and they typically call their supervisor or an L3 or an L4 helpline. You have the mechanism of giving them AR, VR technology so that they're able to A, diagnose the problem on site, and B, provide them AI ML tools that even how to fix that can be done remotely without having to necessarily go back to an expert or call an expert at that point of time, which they may not be available. So you have an ability to fundamentally rethink each priority item and then change it. And therefore, I would very strongly advocate any CXO or a CEO of a company to say, how digital are we? And are we digitally moving and changing fast enough?
Great, thanks, Milan. What I'm going to do also is, while I go to the next person, I'm going to share the results of the poll. Milan, Mo, maybe you want to take a look at that while we go to the next question and see what surprised you in the group's response. But we're going to go to Nichandra, who had a question about sort of global expansion. Nichandra, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, hi. Those were really great insights. And we spoke about the future. Future is here. But I have a question that with the acceleration of COVID, how do we see the implementation of 5G infrastructure, especially in the developing countries? That's the first part of the question. And the second thing that I have in mind is, what are the challenges that we see in implementing a 5G infrastructure, especially in developing countries again? So would love to hear your thoughts.
Why don't I kick it off, and Milan, you can build on it.
Sure.
Every country is a little bit unique in that when you think about 5G, it starts with spectrum availability. So you really have to think about that question in terms of, has the appropriate government entity of X country made spectrum available? And then what is the return on investment case for the carriers in those countries to go deploy 5G? If you look at 4G LTE as kind of a test case for this, generally you found that those countries that had a heavier regulatory construct in terms of the ability to drive a return on investment had a slower deployment and adoption rate for LTE, AKA could the carriers make money, right? It's kind of that simple, like what's the pricing construct? What's the regulatory construct? How many carriers are there? How competitive is that environment? And I would fully expect 5G to be fairly similar. So that's the spectrum aspect. And then the second piece of it, which we touched on a little bit ago, which is both at the, call it the country or the federal level, as well as then the state and local or whatever, the appropriate, equivalent of states is for a given country. What is the regulatory process to go build infrastructure? That, once you have spectrum availability and the use case in terms of how will a carrier make money, then it really just becomes a question of local entities providing them the ability to, send out tower crews and people that actually run the fiber and hang the radio heads, attach those radio heads, et cetera. And again, we find that, by country, those that have the most straightforward path to go deploy in a uniform way with the least, call it regulatory overhead, deploy the fastest and get the associated benefits of that. So again, you've got to kind of look at, each country or region as its own thing. But generally, those are the things in the critical path that we find, whether it's 3G, 4G, or 5G, become the key facets.
Yeah. I just add on from an emerging markets perspective, perhaps, Mo. The reality is that 5G will require a lot more capex than previous versions, if you will, and therefore the question around spectrum, like Mo rightly brought out, how much of spectrum do you have to pay, how much of deployment costs are there? But I think the one major difference between 4G and 5G in particular is that 5G is going to be predicated very heavily on industry use cases. So the level to which industries are willing to put in investments behind digital transformation is going to determine the overall return on 5G. In the emerging markets, therefore, I feel that the underlying investments in digital, until they reach a certain threshold capacity, you will not see a great monetization for 5G. And therefore, my personal belief is that the developed countries and the countries with much larger development of underlying industry will actually do a much, much better job at deploying 5G. And the emerging markets are probably going to be a little slower than it was even in case of 4G.
Great. So when you look at that question number 5, do you think companies are willing to invest in new infrastructures in these times? We've talked a lot about costs, and a bunch of these questions are you surprised that 75% of the people are saying that people are willing to spend and invest during these times? Or is that what you both are seeing as far as from your customer bases as well?
Yeah, that's the most overwhelming answer in all the questions, which was very interesting.
Yeah. The way I think about that one is the way the question is structured is around investing in new infrastructure. Companies, I don't think, invest in new infrastructure. They invest in new outcomes. So to the degree infrastructure enables an outcome, whether it helps them remove OpEx and become more efficient, or it enables a different outcome for their employees, a safer work environment, or it creates some new experience for their end customer, then absolutely COVID is actually going to accelerate every company thinking about that final push to digital, or even the adoption of digital transformation 2.0 to drive OpEx, employee safety, employee benefits, or end user outcomes. So I'm fully aligned with that answer.
Yeah. And what I would say is that, we're seeing this right now, that digital transformation is not just about, deployment of new CapEx and new infrastructure. Digital transformation is about fundamentally moving away from legacy into a new way of thinking and a new way of constructing your infrastructure.
Good point.
Therefore, it's very important that companies actually invest, but the transformation is fundamentally going to be a product of how much you're able to reduce your cost on legacy infrastructure. So the faster you're able to reduce your cost on legacy infrastructure, the greater number of dollars you free up for transformation into digital. And I think that's a balance that a lot of companies will have to go through.
Right. And that actually answers, I think, a couple of the other questions about cost and infrastructure. I think we have time for one more. I'm going to go to Dick Reisman. You are on. You could ask your question. You should be able to unmute.
Yes, hi. Obviously, we're moving toward much more agility, and I'm curious whether you agree with John Markoff's article in the Times today that the key aspect of this is less artificial intelligence and more augmented intelligence, with the idea of being more human-centered and human-controlled, the idea of centaurs and not robots, so that they're really hybrids of man and machine doing a task.
Nice question, Dick. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting article, and what I would say is that I don't think there's an or, I think there's an and. By the way, we refer to that as cobots and not as centaurs, because it's fundamentally, robots augmenting the human procedure or the infrastructure, enabling humans to be more productive and be able to do better things at a higher level. So my view is that it's an and. My view is definitely we will see cobots expand dramatically. I would especially say that for the manufacturing structure. Three things that, to my mind, COVID-19 has impacted, right? Location, things, and people. A lot of companies are now looking at how do we protect and how do we reduce dependencies on this. So you cannot be dependent on a location or a factory. You cannot be dependent on X number of physical things being available. You have to look at virtualizing it, or you have to look at redundancy creation there. And similarly, how do you augment people capabilities? And therefore, in that sense, augmented intelligence or cobots are going to be very important.
Thanks, Milan. Oh, you got any thoughts on that?
I'll just say I totally agree. I haven't had a chance to read that article yet, but I'm going to put it on my reading list for this evening. But the underlying intent, which is that this technology will really elevate the humans that are part of whatever process, I fundamentally agree with that. If you look at the course of human history, but especially the last several hundred years, every new industrial innovation has come with it cries of, this means that these jobs are going away, and what about the people? And every single time, it has elevated humans to more interesting, elevated roles as part of the process. And we're just to kind of bring that to life with a real example, we're seeing more and more grocery stores looking at how can they use robotics for things like, planner scanning, inventory on shelves. My kids love to go into grocery stores and pick up something off one shelf and put it on another shelf, and I'm sure drive people crazy. And you can have your folks in grocery stores either spend their days trying to figure out what needs to be restocked or cleaning up the stocking, or you can have some sort of automated robot doing that work, going back to these answers. And then the human beings, right, in that store can actually then lean in with helping people who are coming in to shop with recommendations and having conversations with them and elevating the customer experience versus something that truly isn't very value added. So, yes.
Thanks so much, Mo. I hadn't gotten to this myself, but it does look like it's a major lead piece in the business section in paper, which I was so busy reading politics and COVID related stuff in the first section I love getting the physical paper during this weird digital time. This has been a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much, Mo. Thank you so much, Milan. Thank you to Wipro for its partnership. I want to turn it back over to Josh to wrap, but I'm looking forward to writing this up, and we'll post the video next week. I'm sure Josh will reiterate this, but really excellent, really good conversation. Thank you both.
And Josh,
Thanks,
you have to tell us why you're in a bar. It looks like you're in a, are you sheltering in place in a bar environment? What's going on?
Something about his values, perhaps.
Yeah, this is actually my house. So this is where I chose to get away from the dog and the kids today. This was the place that was left. So appreciate it. But Mo and Milan and David, thank you again for a great conversation.